Hey everyone, welcome back to another lesson. So let's go ahead and talk about object-oriented programming a little bit. I want to show you some, visual examples to explain what is this thing first, and then we're going to get into the code in the next lessons. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing so far. If you remember in the previous lessons and the previous sections, we've been, getting into more complex projects, right? And one of the things that have been happening, if you think about it, is that as we're getting into more complex projects, our code is actually starting to become more like a spaghetti. In its sense that, we're creating more complex code, we're creating more complex functions, and what is happening is that we're ending up with a code where each portion of that code is related to another portion. We got functions within functions, we got, variables that are used globally, locally, all that stuff. So we got a lot of things going on in our code, and, we got a portion of our code related to another portion. And see, I just made some lines here, but our code is becoming a lot more complex. Now, the problem with this is that if you're creating a very, very complicated project, a real, web development or something like a software, very complicated software, this is not the best way to actually do something, because so far, even though we've been getting into more complicated, code, essentially our code is still kind of elementary. That's why we called it the beginner, right? Because it's still elementary. But as we get into more real complicated projects, we need to find a more efficient way to create our code. Because the thing is, so far, I just want to give you these names, and as you see it up here, so far, what we've been doing, the way we've been actually writing our code is called procedural programming, in a sense that, we are writing the code, it's just being used within we created all these functions and all these different things, and they've been used within the code itself, within the program, and that is pretty much it. It's kind of a one-time use type of thing, or type of function, or type of code that we're creating. And again, that is fine if you're tackling really more simple projects. But if you're getting into, let's say you're working on a very complex project, which, it's made of maybe tens of thousands of lines of code, how do you actually do it? How do you actually make that less complex? Because think about it. If you're creating a very complex project, you're going to have thousands of different relations, from variable to variable, function to variable, all sorts of things, all sorts of if and else statements. So it becomes really, really complex to manage that. Also becomes really, really complex to write it, and becomes complex to read it, and all sorts of things. So everything becomes a lot harder, right? And this is one of the biggest, paradigms of programming. It's just things become complex, equally complex, as you work on more complicated product or complicated software. So how do you actually fix this problem? Now, this is where the object-oriented programming comes in. Now, the idea with an object-oriented programming is that instead of just creating a single code that is going to do one thing, and it's going to have a few functions that just does whatever you want it to do, instead of doing that, what you're going to do is you're going to divide your complex project into smaller things, and you're going to have maybe, you're going to work on a portion of that, complex project each time. Or if you're working within a team, each team is going to grab a portion of that code and is going to create a portion of that code. And again, if you're actually trying to get a job in some software development company or something like that, that is pretty much what you're going to be doing. You're not going to be designing, let's say if you get a job with Microsoft, you're not going to be designing the Microsoft stack by yourself. You're going to be just creating a portion, a very small portion of that code, and your code is going to be added to a more, to add a bunch of other codes, and it's going to make up the final product. Again, that is object-oriented programming. So let's actually talk about that in a more, in a more cleaner example. All right. Again, I just want you to understand, when you work on a complex project, let's say you're working it within a team, that is how things are going to go. Everyone is going to focus on a small portion of that code, a small functionality of that code, and then you're going to, all of that at the end, put all of that together to create the final product. That is how things work when you develop complicated software. And even if you do it yourself, like me, I actually a long time ago, a couple of years ago, I designed a very, very complex software as service company, and I did all of it by myself. But what I did was that I cut that project into different modules and different portions, and each time I worked on a separate portion of that. That's again object-oriented programming. Let's actually talk about an example. Let's say you are tasked with designing the software for a self-driving car. All right, so that is your job, right? So, and again, this is me really simplifying it, because building software for a self-driving car is a massive task. Obviously, it's beyond the scope of this section or where we're at the moment. But my point is that you're working on a very complex project, right? So you have a bunch of stuff that to design your team, right? And you divide your team into different teams, and each team essentially works on a different portion of the software. One of them is going to work, for example, on the sensor system, on the camera system, whatever it is. One of them is going to work on the detection system, like the road detection, the road systems detecting like signs of the road, all sorts of things. Another team is going to work on the map project, on the map portion, right? Designing the navigation software, map software, and all that stuff. Another team is going to work on the battery management. For example, if the battery is low, what to do with the other portion of the code, or the battery is low, send a signal to the navigation and tell the user that they need to go charge their car, and like where do they go, find them maybe places they can charge their car. Again, all sorts of complicated things. But the point is that each team is working on a separate portion of this entire system, and at the end all of this is going to come together to build this final software. That is object-oriented programming. And again, the idea with this, besides making your life a lot easier and making creating and writing complicated code a lot simpler, right? That's the idea with it. Another thing that it does, which is really, really powerful, and it's one of the reasons that we are where we are today with software in our world, it really is because of the object-oriented programming. And the reason for that is that it's reusable in other things. Okay, for example, when you design a car system, let's say you work in a company and you're working on the self-driving system, right? And the next year the company comes in and say, hey, we want to create self-flying drones that deliver boxes. All right, that's what we're going to do. Guess what? We have already designed a bunch of these systems. We've designed a battery system, right? We designed a navigation system. We designed a sensor system. So all of that is already done. So all we got to do is just design the stuff that we need to design, build the code, the remaining things that we need to build. So that's object-oriented programming, because we've already done portions of this. What we can do is we can actually continue creating the things that we haven't done before, writing the code that we haven't done before. So that's really a beauty of it. It allows you to grab these things that you've created and move them to a new program as well. It just saves you time, and also it just makes it a lot more modular. And when you design and when you work on a massive coding project, each team can actually pick up a portion of that and build that easily without actually confusing themselves. So it's really, really powerful stuff, guys. And again, object-oriented programming is the number one type of way that you want to program. And generally, when you work on a complicated project, or when you're working with a team, you will have to do object-oriented programming, because that's just like it's pretty much a must. All right, and that's what we're going to talk about in this module in detail. All right. Now, I want to use another example, and this is kind of it's going to help you to understand object-oriented programming a little bit better. Imagine you own a restaurant, okay? And you have two options. Option one, if you want to, like, let's say, again, we're talking in code here, right? Option one, you can run the restaurant by yourself. And that's very possible. You can take the orders, you can go back and cook it, you can actually, bring the order to the customer, you can clean and all that stuff. Like, you can do all of that really. And there are some examples of one-man restaurants, but it's not going to be as efficient. You're not going to be able to serve a lot of customers. That's pretty much what we're doing with procedural programming at the moment. Everything that we're building is just, in a way, procedural is basically this is how you can describe it. One person is doing all these little things and just serving the entire, let's say, restaurant. And again, that's not very efficient. But with object-oriented programming, when you have that in place, that is essentially like having multiple employees. You have an employee that is a manager, you have an employee that is taking orders, you have a chef that is making the food, you have someone cleaning, and all that stuff. So everybody's doing their job, and together they make a restaurant. That is object-oriented programming. So I hope that made sense, guys. I hope these examples were useful. And again, the idea of object-oriented programming is very, very powerful. Again, it's the reason the software we have today is where it is today, is because of the object-oriented programming, because the way software is built, it's modular, it can be used in different places. So really powerful stuff, and that's what we're going to work on in this, in this section. I'm going to talk about all sorts of object-oriented programmings, examples. I'm going to show you all the things you need to know to create amazing and complex software, because that's something that we're going to be moving on forward. In the next sections, we're going to get into really complicated projects. So I want you to know this because it's incredibly important, especially even if you want to get a job. Very important stuff. So let's get started. Let's get into code a little bit. I might drop some examples here and there after this, but I want to keep it visual at the same time. I want to show you the code and explain how do you actually create programs like this. All right, and how do you write code. Anyways, let's get started, and I'll see you in the next video. But let me know if you have any questions about this so far. All right, so I'll see you in the next one, guys.